One of the things that the book begins by doing is just setting a context for food insecurity in South Africa. How big an issue is this?
I think it's an enormous issue. It's probably the biggest social challenge that we face at the moment. We have probably about 80% of South African households cannot afford to buy enough food to feed themselves a nutritious meal every single day. 25% of South African children are classified as stunted, which means that their cognitive development is compromised. They struggle to learn in school. They are much more likely to suffer poor health effects later in life. And there's also a strong connection between childhood malnutrition and violence in later life. So this is a huge problem that the country is facing.
One of the things that you do is that you also make a deliberate attempt to clarify between the issue of malnutrition and access to food that is nutritious. Many people often don't understand that link. They think just because there's bread in the house, then it's fine. But often that's not what your body needs in order to survive.
Exactly. So there's a big difference between having a full stomach and actually having adequate nutrition. So the poorest people in this country, their diets are made up almost entirely of maize meal, of bread, sugar, a little tea, and a little bit of very poor quality protein. And that is not sufficient, especially for young children, for cognitive development and physical development. So just because people don't feel hungry doesn't mean that they're not malnourished. Having said that, almost 2,000 children under the age of 5 die in hospital of starvation every year. And this is in a country that classifies as a middle-income country on a GDP per capita.
Let's look at the inequality that the issue of food then also perpetuates in South Africa. The fact that there are those who get to sit at the table and eat, as you put it in the book, and those who don't.
What we're doing is that it's children from the poorest families, the children who are already disadvantaged, exactly the children that our social and economic transformation was supposed to improve their lives. These are the children that are being sentenced to a life of poor health. It's extremely difficult for children to learn in school when they haven't had anything to eat at home. They get a small meal at school, sometimes under the school feeding scheme. They have very little food at home in the school holidays. And these are exactly the children that are then being condemned to a life of continuing poverty, exactly because of malnutrition and to violence.
Let's talk about the violence factor. How does that then influence violence, and especially the studies that you've looked at amongst young children? Because that's why I think you're able to tell the most clear story about the link between hunger and violence.
Absolutely. What the research shows is that there's a strong link between poor nutrition in children before birth and in the first 3 years of life, and damage to the brain's impulse control mechanism. And it's impulse control that determines how you respond in a situation. So if you say something to annoy me, whether I just say don't do that or actually physically assault you is determined to a very large extent by what's going on in the brain's impulse control. And there's overwhelming evidence to show that malnutrition damages the brain's impulse control. So it makes these children very much more predisposed to violence in later life. And it goes a long way towards explaining why South Africa has such high levels of domestic violence compared to countries that have similar levels of GDP, and it's because we have much higher levels of child malnutrition.
And that's just on the consumption side, Dr. Ledger. On the production side also, there's a great story to be told there about the fact that South Africans don't actually produce or even own the food that they're eating. Some of the difficulties that arise in the production chain. Speak to us a little bit about that.
Well, what we have is that if we talk about something called the terms of trade, which is the share that farmers get out of the retail price of food, that has been steadily declining. So for example, milk is a good example. So the farmers get paid R4.50 a litre for milk, more or less, and we pay something between 12 and 18 Rand a litre for milk. And at that price, consumers cannot afford to drink milk, especially poor children who need to drink about half a litre of milk or mass every day. Buying that would cost more than half of the childcare grant. But at the same time, significant numbers of dairy farmers have gone out of business. People have lost their jobs in dairy. As a result of the drought, the farmers got an extra 60 cents a litre, and we all paid an extra 2 to 3 Rand a litre more for milk. So it's not the drought that's making food more unaffordable. That's just a small contributing factor. It's corporate power in the food chain which is taking a greater and greater share and making food more and more unaffordable.
What does that mean then for the country going forward? Because it means that we just can't afford, the very basics in terms of what we need for daily nutrition, especially for people who are considered the poorest of the poor.
I think the message in the book is that everybody has got to catch a wake up. The reason why I wrote the book is because I realized that the average South African doesn't really have a good idea of what's going on in the food system. And we need to do something about it. We need to understand we are one of only 22 countries in the world that has a constitutional right to food. And sometimes I think government has forgotten that. There's no constitutional right to corporate profit in the Constitution. But there are 2 sections of the Constitution that guarantee children the right to food. So how did we end up as a country where thousands of children die of starvation every year and millions more are sentenced to lives of poor health and inability to learn in school? We have to remember our priorities.
Is there any way that consumers can take that power back, especially from the corporates who now own the space and are making the most profit out of food in South Africa?
Oh, absolutely. It's our money that keeps the system going. Even the poorest households have to eat. Food is big business in South Africa. Billions and billions and billions of rand are traded. And if we want our food system to look differently, we can use our money and our power in the system to make it different.
How do we do it?
Well, one of the things is farm workers, for example. So farm workers are among the most food insecure and poor people in South Africa. The wages that they are paid is nowhere near enough to feed their families. Most of them live in terrible conditions. And a lot of that has got to do with the price that farmers get for food. So if we wanted a campaign to force supermarkets to make sure that they only buy from farmers that pay their workers a decent wage, we could do it. This is how sanctions against apartheid worked. People didn't buy South African goods because they didn't agree with the way in which black people were being treated in the country. We've seen the documentary that was recently done by the Danish filmmaker about wine, which saw Danish consumers saying, we're not buying wine anymore. So if we want a different system, we just need to apply our minds to it. In the 80s, consumer boycotts of white business were extremely effective as a tool of exercising political power. And we need to remember our history in order to go forward, I think.
All right. Thank you so much for coming into studio and